Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. As you guys know, we're in the coronavirus shutdown. I'm converting my online classes to my face-to-face classes to online, and these videos are intended for students that are enrolled in my Human Anatomy and Physiology class. If anyone else out there stumbles across these and they're helpful, great, let me know so I can continue to do them. These are impromptu videos. These are done in one take with no editing. So bear with me. This is as if I'm just lecturing in class. I don't get the chance to redo things. So anyway, this is number 8 in the series of neuroscience or neurobiology videos, the nervous system. And we're doing the anatomy of the brain and the organization of the brain to some degree. So if you're in my class, we're going to start around page 72. And actually a little bit of this information was on the previous page. I believe it's on the bottom of page 71. Yeah, bottom of page 71 and moving on to page 72. Now, as I was getting ready for this and looking over my note set, I realized my note set is not organized in the most logical or easy to follow fashion. So along with the worksheet, there will be sort of a basic layout of the brain structures and their functions. I'm going to go over that in this lecture. So before I get started on the brain itself, one of the things we need to look at is kind of how is the nervous system set up and organized, and that'll help us understand how the brain functions. When we look at the brain, one of the things we look at and we talk about stuff called gray matter, and we talk about white matter, the two different types of tissue that make up the brain or the nervous system. Okay, so gray matter and white matter are slightly different. When we look at the structure of a neuron, let's say we have a multipolar neuron here with all its dendrites, its axon hillock, its axon, and then it branches down here and has all the telodendria and synaptic knobs. Okay, some axons are myelinated, some are not. So if I put a bunch of Schwann cells here and made a myelin sheath, or if we were in the CNS, they would be called oligodendrocytes. But if I have a myelin sheath here, you notice there's no myelination on the dendrites or the soma. They're never myelinated. So when we talk about white matter, what makes the white matter white is the myelin coming from Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes. Schwann cells in the PNS, oligodendrocytes in the CNS. So when we talk about white matter, what we're talking about is myelinated axons. It is almost entirely myelinated axons. When you look at the brain model, when we slice the brain open and you saw that outer layer of the cerebral cortex, you saw sort of all those white lines running through here, that would be the white matter. That would be the axons running through connecting parts of the brain. Now, when we talk about gray matter, what we're talking about is it is made up of what we say somata. Somata is plural for the word soma. It's made up of dendrites, and it's unmyelinated axons. So whenever we're talking about gray matter or white matter, we're talking about whether we're talking about myelinated axons only or we're talking about somata, dendrites, and unmyelinated axons. Now, a lot of the gray matter, since the somata are there, our brain is set up sort of like this. Okay, let me give you a quick example. And it's kind of hard to really visualize this, but let's say here's your eyeball, here's your cerebral cortex, your hypothalamus and the thalamus in here, and your cerebral cortex wraps around all of that. You have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla coming down with the cerebellum. Okay? Sorry, I didn't do that very well. Your optic nerve comes in right here at the tip of the hypothalamus. Some of the neurons will go over in the fornix back here to the visual cortex where we process vision. Okay? This is going to be in the occipital lobe, and we haven't covered all of this yet, but nonetheless. Now, way over here, let's say we have the post and the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is where we have the primary motor cortex, where we process motor information. Up here in the front of the brain, we do some real complex thinking, like sequential events and problem solving. And over here, there's an area on one of the two hemispheres called Broca's brain, where it's sort of our speech area, where we form speech patterns, the motor coordination, or at least the thought to initiate the muscles that fire to make speech. Okay, and then way down here in the hypothalamus is some of our hormones that can stimulate other areas of the body and affect them. and cause us to feel anxious or nervous or excited, happy. And where the fornix comes down, I'm not expecting you to know all this yet. I'm getting somewhere with this. When the fornix comes down, it splits on either side. If you remember on the brain model, we had the fornix come back and then it splits into these two yellow-looking things that curve around, at least in my lab. Well, way down here is a structure called the amygdala. The amygdala is linked as part of our limbic system, where we have a lot of emotions and behavioral instincts, aggression, fear, excitement. And right before that, there's an area here called the hippocampus where we store a lot of memories and we do a lot of memory formation, consolidation, memory and learning. Now, the reason I mention all that is because of this. Let's say I have a group of neurons that all process the same information. And I'm going to look at in the CNS and in the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. Okay? If I have a collection of somata, neuron cell bodies, right? So I got a bunch of neuron cell bodies here with their nuclei and a whole bunch of these neurons, all with their dendrites, and I'm not going to draw the dendrites and axon, but I got a whole bunch of neurons here that all process the same information. Let's say that's an area in the visual cortex back here. All of these neurons are going to process visual information. Well, they're going to receive synapses and neurotransmitter from neurons through the optic nerve, through the optic tract, all the way back there. So when you see something, these neurons might get stimulated. For example, if you were sitting in a math class and the teacher said this, the teacher says, I'm going to give you a set of rules and situation. I'm going to write an equation on the board. If you know the answer, and as soon as you know the answer, raise your hand and say, got it. You cannot blurt the answer out. If you do, you lose points. If I call on you, then you put your hand down and stand up, and you can give me the answer to the equation. Okay? So there's a whole series of events that are going to happen. And then your teacher starts with something like this. Well, these neurons are going to fire back on a part of your brain in the occipital lobe where you're going to detect what is it that I'm seeing. Sort of a what center. What am I seeing? You're seeing some lines on a board that represent some numbers. In order for you to recall what these particular shapes mean, then neurons here have to send axons maybe into the hippocampus, not directly but through some other pathways, and fire to see, okay, what does this shape mean? That's the number 4. That's a plus. That's 2. Okay, and then some of the neurons are also going to have to fire way up here in the frontal cortex where we say, okay, what is the answer to this? What is 4 plus 2? And some of those neurons may have to fire back on the hippocampus so that you can remember the answer. 4 plus 2 equals this. All the while, some of the neurons are going to fire up here in your motor cortex so that you can raise your hand. And some of the neurons here, up here in your prefrontal cortex, are also going to have to fire in Broca's area and say, don't say the answer. Don't do it. And then, if the teacher calls on you, when you hear it, there's going to be neurons from your ear that come in and go to the temporal lobe. They're going to go in and maybe tell your brain, go ahead and put your hand down, stand up, which means they got to fire over here again on several areas so that you can put your hand down and you stand up, and then you turn on Broca's area and you can say, ma'am, that answer is 6. Oh, and by the way, not only do you have to do that, you have to fire some other motor neurons along the way. And the whole time you're firing maybe on your limbic system because you're getting excited, the teacher called on you, you're going to get some points. So you can see how just one small thing like coming up with the answer involves many areas of the brain. So the brain is compartmentalized in areas that handle different tasks or functions. Now in the CNS, where I have a collection of neuron cell bodies, we call that very often a nucleus or a center. So if I talk about a particular nucleus and I say this is a nucleus for I don't know, this, there's different nuclear centers. One of the things we talk about is we talk about the visual center. We talk about the respiratory rhythmicity center, or the nucleus that controls some of your speech function. So we're talking about a group of neuron cell bodies. From here on out, when you hear me say nucleus or center, I'm not talking about the nucleus of a cell. I'm talking about a nucleus, a collection of neurons that process certain information. In the peripheral nervous system, we usually call that a ganglion, and plural would be ganglia. Now, there's a thing that I refer to as a bundle of axons. A bundle of axons would be like a cable. If you take a cable, for example, I have a small cable here. If I cut this cable and I pull the plastic back, you'll see that there's a bunch of smaller copper wires inside. Every one of those wires is conducting electricity. Well, each wire would represent an axon from a neuron. The cable represents a whole bunch of axons that share a common origin and a destination. For example, if these cells had to fire on two different other nuclei or centers, I might have a group of neurons over here that process information and a group of neurons over here that process different information. Some of these cells would send axons all to this location, and I would bundle those up in a much larger cable. And some of these cells might send axons to this location, so I will bundle those up in a different cable. So a bundle of axons that share a common origin and destination in the CNS we very often call a tract, or sometimes we call it a fascicle. There's a thing called the fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis we could talk about. We're not going to right now. In the peripheral nervous system, we call this a nerve. Okay? So this terminology, when I say these words, you need to be thinking of areas of the brain that process, or in the spinal cord, that process specific information. Or if I'm talking about it in the peripheral nervous system, it would be called a ganglion, like an autonomic ganglion, or the dorsal root ganglion is a collection of neuron cell bodies. Now, if I'm talking about bundles of axons, inside the CNS, these axons that are going from one location to another and they share the same origin and destination, call that a tract or fascicle. So we might talk about the optic nerve and the optic tract. All the neurons coming out of your eyeball going into the brain are called the optic nerve. Once they meet at the optic chiasm and cross, they are now inside the brain. They're called the optic tract. So we'll use this terminology a lot, and I wanted you to be able to visualize kind of how the brain is set up with lots of nuclei and centers everywhere, and lots of tracts and fascicles going everywhere. Out in the peripheral nervous system, we would have ganglia and nerves doing the same kind of setup. Wherever there's gray matter, there's usually a lot of the processing structures that are going to process information. White matter is just the wires connecting all of these centers. Your brain is set up like a computer motherboard, almost like a computer. If you ever seen the green resin, phenolic resin motherboards that in a computer that have all the little processors and chips plugged in with all the little gold wires, that's your central processing unit. That's your CNS. And then on the computer, your mouse, the wire from your mouse, even though it might be cordless, they used to have wires to them, and your keypad and your screen that's giving information out is all the peripheral nervous system. The afferent puts information in, the efferent gives you the motor output to make adjustments. And so the way our CNS is set up is very much like that. And the gray matter, while it's doing most of the thinking, the white matter, the wires or connections are just as important. If someone were to have some head trauma and they were to cut maybe a bundle of neurons going to a certain part of the brain, then they would not be able to communicate from here to there, and they might lose some particular function in the nervous system. They might have problems with sequential events or processing visual information. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So now, let me get to the brain structures. This video is going to be a little bit long because there's a lot of stuff to go over in the brain, and I'm barely going to scratch the surface. The way I like to teach the brain and think about the brain, since I am a neurobiologist by training, is this way. Okay? So, our brain evolved from the bottom up. And we really evolved from much simpler animals. So think about an ancient worm in the ocean, these ancient flatworms. They had an oral opening, they had like a mouth, and they had an anus so that food could go through and they could get nutrients. They had to have a nervous system that controlled the muscles for them to swim around and to control the digestive tract. They had a primitive little structure like a heart and somewhat of a respiratory system where they could absorb oxygen from the water around them. So they had this primitive nervous system. A couple of neurons way up here at the front, literally just a few. Somewhat of a spinal cord that has little nerves coming out controlling some of these other functions. Rather simple creature. Well, if we look at the base of our brain, we have the spinal cord is connected to the medulla, and then we have the pons sitting on top of that. We have the midbrain, and then we have the diencephalon over here like this. The putamen, internal capsule, caudate nucleus. If you learned all your anatomy, you'd have the basal ganglia. This would be the thalamus right across the middle. This would be medulla oblongata, pons, midbrain, right? And then way up here, we would have the fornix sitting on top of the thalamus, the septum pellucidum, and the corpus callosum. Sorry, that's not very good. The corpus callosum coming across here. This would form our lateral ventricles. The third ventricle would be inside the thalamus, and the fourth ventricle would be at the back of the pons. By the way, behind all of the pons and medulla, there's a part of the brain called the cerebellum sticking out here. So I'm trying to give you an idea of the layout of the brain. And then way up here would be my two cerebral hemispheres with all the white matter. This would be the longitudinal fissure, goes down to the corpus callosum. If I were looking at the brain from a lateral view, then I would see the cerebrum up here like this. I would have the pons and the medulla coming down, and the cerebellum is attached to the pons and the medulla. If I could slice open in here, I would have the thalamus, the hypothalamus. It's supposed to be a lowercase h, but you should know that anatomy or be learning it. The optic nerve and optic chiasm, the pituitary gland, the mammillary body would be right about there. And we'd have the fornix curving over the top of the thalamus. We'd have the corpus callosum over the top of that, the membrane connecting them, the septum pellucidum. On the back of the midbrain would be a superior and inferior colliculus and a pineal gland. Okay, I don't have all of that here, but what you could see here is you would see sort of where the optic chiasm crosses like this. Oops. I hope this picture's making sense to you. It's starting to get a little bit messy. We'd have the pituitary gland hanging off there. We'd have two little mammillary bodies. There's your midbrain. Okay, so we have all this anatomy going on. Okay, well, the pons is the equivalent of this ancient brain. If you think about it, this little worm could do nothing more than eat, breathe, to some degree, do respiration, exchanging with water, oxygen with water, and carbon dioxide with water, and a little bit of motor coordination and controlling heart function. So when we think about what we call the lower part of the brain, the pons and the medulla, within the pons and the medulla is where we house what we call the centers for vital functions. That's in the pons and the medulla. They house the centers for what we call the vital functions. Vita means life, so life signs. That means it can affect heart rate, respiration, and some digestion. Those neurons that can control our basic vital functions, things to do with heart rate and blood pressure and vessel diameter and respiration and digestion, the most basic life functions are all in the lower part of the brain. The cerebellum has neurons. They actually come up and down through the medulla and spinal cord. They come out the pons and wrap around into the cerebellum. The cerebellum is where we do a lot of motor coordination. It's not where we initiate the thoughts for motor function to occur. We initiate the thoughts to move much higher in the brain. Those signals get sent down to lower centers in the basal nuclei, and then from there into the cerebellum, which does the coordination. Which muscles do I need to fire? And if you think about it, eventually, if two of these little worms were existing in the ancient ocean, the one that was going to survive, have energy and strength to survive and swim and avoid predators and mate, would be the one that can maybe coordinate its motor control so it could swim faster in a more uniform function instead of having random muscle contractions and spazzing out. So the cerebellum is kind of an ancient part of the brain that does a lot of motor coordination. Now, when we go a little bit higher to the midbrain, the midbrain houses a couple of major structures, 4 of them actually, called the corpora quadrigemina. And the 2 top ones, called the superior colliculi, actually do what we call visual reflexes. So if you think about one of these ancient worms, a little bit after a certain amount of time, one of these worms evolved a little eye spot way up on the front of it. That eye spot was sensitive to UV light. So in a deep, dark ocean, if sunlight is hitting this way, and maybe clouds are making it dark here, or there's rocks and things, guess where all the bacteria and algae are going to grow? And plant life, photosynthesis, where there's light. So if he can detect light, he can swim to where the food is, and someone who couldn't would just have to randomly hope he bumps into food. These guys would eventually die out because these guys would find all the food, eat it all, and then be able to breed and outcompete them. Natural selection, so to speak. Well, that would be your superior colliculus. The superior colliculus does our visual reflexes. Now, what we call sound would be detected by some organisms, especially in the ocean, as vibrations of the water molecules around them. So our ear evolved from similar organs and structures that can detect vibrations in the water. Because if something's vibrating in the water, it's probably either food coming towards you, or it's a predator swimming towards you. So in ancient organisms, if you disturb the water around them, they all take off. They don't even think about it. And that's kind of what happens here in the inferior colliculus. It does what we call auditory reflexes. Now these are in humans, but they evolved from these ancient organisms. And those auditory reflexes would be things like, if you hear a loud sound, you turn your head towards it to figure out what it is. Okay? So there's a lot of motor coordination kind of going on in here as well. There's some lower motor systems that our brain, when we decide to move, turns it over to some areas in the midbrain. And then it goes through the pons into the cerebellum. Okay? So the midbrain does some of the motor coordination for things like your posture and walking, but not the real coordination itself, like juggling or tap dancing and things. That's handled by the cerebellum. Now, when we go a little bit higher, maybe we can develop some emotional reactions to things. Not only do we need to be able to find food, we need to be able to get excited about places where we do find food. And when we get excited about things, we can remember them. So memory and emotion are very tightly linked. If you go somewhere where there's food and predators jump out and they scare you to death, you want to remember that so that you know that place is dangerous. If I go look for food there, I could die. If I go look for food over here, I'll survive because everyone was nice and friendly and sharing food. And so we want to have that memory. Same thing with mates. If you go looking for a mate when deers are in rutting season, they know to return to the same location. They know where the deer feeder is. They also know where the females are, so that the male deers will show up and look for mates. And the females know where the males are, so they'll show up and look for them. So survival and reproduction, right? Eating and avoiding becoming food and finding a mate. Well, that's part of what we call the limbic system. And the limbic system is sort of connected through the fornix to what we call the hippocampus and the amygdala. There are a few other structures in the limbic system. So I'm going to write this up here. Okay? Limbus means border. And so the limbic system, a couple of the major structures, one is called the hippocampus. Hippocampus means seahorse because it's shaped like a little seahorse. It's a little odd-shaped structure. It's where I did a lot of research at one point in my career in memory and learning. The hippocampus is where we have memory and learning. This is where we consolidate memories. We have short-term memory, and then short-term memory, if we continue to stimulate it over and over and over through repetition, like when you're trying to learn something, you convert it to long-term memory. And then when it comes to that long-term memory conversion, we call that sort of learning and then recall. So it's where our memories are stored, where we learn memories, and where we can recall memories. And there's another structure called the amygdala. You may have heard of this if you take some psychology courses. The amygdala has a lot of emotions and instinctive type behaviors associated with it. So if I ask you to recall your worst event in your life, the worst day of your life, you're not only going to have a memory, you're going to have an emotional reaction to it. A feeling will come over you. If I ask you to recall one of your favorite memories or best moments in your life, then you're going to have an emotion attached to that. And also sometimes those things can trigger instinctive behaviors. So that's what the amygdala does. A lot of anger, or aggression, or fear, emotion, and some instinctive behaviors. So that's part of our limbic system, which it's kind of hard to see here, so I'm going to put it in green. But the limbic system would be where the fornix curves around. That doesn't quite look green now, does it? The fornix curves around, and it wraps on both sides around where the thalamus is, and right at the tip is where the amygdala would be. Okay. Now, in order to have all those emotions and memories and things and stuff to react to, you actually have to have something that knows where to send the axons to. So I'm going to erase this, and we're going to talk about the thalamus for a minute. The thalamus is what we call a sensory filter and relay organ. So, in order for us to have reactions to things, we have to have sensory input. So all of our intero and extero receptors are sending information through the spinal cord, up through the midbrain, and into the thalamus. I think of the thalamus as sort of an operator. If you look at old school operators and old buildings, long before y'all's time, but if you called, say, a hotel, you couldn't call directly to a room number. You called an operating board. And if you look at old videos, there was a lady or a guy sitting there with headphones on, and they'd answer the phone. Yes, I need to speak to someone in room 237. Okay, one moment, please. They would physically unplug the cable that they received and patch you into room 237 so that that phone call would go directly to that room. If someone called in and needed to speak to somebody else, they could patch that to the room. So they took all the incoming information and decided, where does it go? If someone called in and said, I need to talk to the boss, and they say, well, may I ask who's speaking? They say, well, I'm a vacuum cleaner salesman from Walla Walla, Washington. Well, they may say, I'm sorry, they're not available right now, and not let the information through. So the thalamus filters sensory information out that's unnecessary. Literally like 99.9% of it. I mean, most of the sensory information, the information bombarding your body, from the clothes on the surface of your body that you're feeling, that you're filtering out, to maybe the cushion of the seat pressing on your bottom, to your glasses sitting on your face, or the AC or any background noise. I always have classical music on in the background. I try to keep it to where y'all can't hear it. But all those sensations that are not affecting survival and reproduction, eventually we have to filter those out so we can let only important information through. So the thalamus is a sensory filter, and then it's a sensory relay. What's that? This kind of sensory information? Okay, well then let me send the axons through the internal capsule out to those parts of the brain that handle that information. So it's going to relay it, just like that operator connecting you to the person you need to connect to. Okay. Now, just below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, which would be right down here. Okay. So, the hypothalamus. It is a major link between the nervous system should be a U, and the endocrine system. The endocrine system is your hormonal system. There are two ways that cells can communicate to other cells. One is in neurons. They send an axon and literally release a neurotransmitter directly onto the next cell. And other cells, called endocrine organs or glands, can release a compound in our bloodstream called a hormone. Here, this would be a neurotransmitter, but hormones would travel through your bloodstream over great distances and sometimes to more than one group of cells. And these cells, very much like the postsynaptic cell, would have receptors for these hormones. And when I dump this hormone in the bloodstream, some may pop out over here and some may go here to two different classes or multiple classes of cells. We call that the endocrine system, the series of glands and cells and the hormones that communicate information from a gland to another group of cells. So we have neuronal communication and we have hormonal communication. So our brain can communicate to some parts of the body through neurons. So we'll send axons out to our heart and our muscles. But sometimes we need to communicate to multiple groups of cells at once for a long period of time, and we can dump hormones into the bloodstream from part of the brain, the hypothalamus in particular, and the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus sends axons and hormones into the pituitary gland, and then that will subsequently release more hormones that affect many different parts of our body. So it links the nervous and the endocrine system. Your hypothalamus is also monitoring things like body temperature and ions, the electrolytes in your blood, like sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium. Sometimes you just get a craving to eat something salty because your body is lacking maybe some sodium. Well, it is the hypothalamus that is getting some blood flow, detecting that need, and sending signals to other parts of your brain so that you have a certain craving for salt or sugar or fat or water when you got to chug water or whatever. So it does not only the link between the nervous and the endocrine system, but it monitors electrolytes or ions. It monitors a few other things, and body temperature is another one. Okay, so those are two major structures. They can affect many other things like our drives and our responses to things, but nonetheless. So let's start reviewing real quick. Basic vital function: heart rate, digestion, and breathing in the medulla and pons. The pons is a bridge to the cerebellum, which does a lot of motor coordination. The midbrain has some motor commands coming out of it, but on the back of the midbrain we have visual reflexes and auditory reflexes. The superior colliculus does visual reflexes, the inferior colliculus does auditory reflexes. When we get above that, we get to the diencephalon, and in the diencephalon, the thalamus is our sensory filter and sensory relay system. The hypothalamus is going to link some of those sensations and that input from our nervous system to our hormonal system, our endocrine system, and it's also monitoring blood pressure, body temperature, and some other things. And then we have the limbic system, which is sort of the border between all of these structures and the cerebrum. The limbic system includes the hippocampus, which is where we store memories and do learning, and the amygdala, which has some emotional reactions and responses that are linked to memory, like fear and anger and hunger and some joy and some other things. Now, these are very basic, and some of these things are also things like joy, and our reward system involves other parts of the brain as well. I'm just trying to keep it simple. It's so complex. I could spend another 2 years talking about the brain and still not even talk about it all. Okay, so now we've been moving up through the brain from page 72 into page 73 in my note set. So if you're in my class, you should be following the note set. The basal ganglia, remember we have the putamen, the internal capsule, and the caudate nucleus down here on the sides of the diencephalon. They have a lot of motor function. They're sort of what we call the lower motor centers. We think about the thought to initiate movement starts in the precentral gyrus, the primary motor cortex, and then that gets sent down to the basal nuclei, the putamen, internal capsule, caudate nucleus, and they do a lot of sort of the lower thinking of our motor function. You might say, hey, I need to walk down the hallway here, fire the muscles for walking, and then those lower motor centers start coordinating which muscle groups, and then that goes into the cerebellum, which then does the ultimate motor control for you to walk. But they do a lot of that lower level thinking about movement. Like when you're walking and you're moving your hands for balance, you're not thinking, if I step forward with my left foot, I need to put my right hand forward, and vice versa. Those are the lower motor centers that are doing things well below our consciousness. Okay. The limbic system, we said, does a lot of emotions and fear and memory and long-term memories. And then the cerebral cortex. Okay. The cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the cerebrum, is where we do the highest level thinking, very complex thinking. We don't have a different brain than ancient organisms or monkeys and cats and turtles and fish. We just have evolved more. So the higher the level of intelligence and the more social interaction we have, the more cerebral cortex we have for very complex thinking and processing of complex stuff. Okay? And we're going to go through all the parts of the cerebral cortex in just a little bit, or in just a few minutes. So if you're following the note set on page 73, I'm going to skip the ventricles. We're going to talk about those at the very end. When we get to page 74 at the bottom, it reiterates the hypothalamus. It reiterates the pituitary gland, which links a lot of hormones. One thing I did not talk about is the pineal gland, which is hanging way off the back of the fornix back here. The pineal gland secretes a hormone called melatonin, and melatonin regulates what we call our day and night rhythms, or circadian rhythms. So you may have heard of melatonin as the sleep hormone. Melatonin is a hormone, and I like to say melatonin mellows you out, puts you to sleep, chills you out. So melatonin is secreted by the pineal gland. And so the function of the pineal gland is what we call the circadian rhythms. So even if you are in a building working all day, 12 hours or so, you have this sense that it's dark outside, even if there's no windows. We have this sense of our daily cycle, when we need to sleep, when we need to wake, when we need to do certain things. Circa comes from circle, 24-hour, and dia is day. So throughout a 24-hour day, there's certain parts where you're active and certain parts where you're not. And the pineal gland is involved in regulating our circadian rhythms by the release of melatonin. Try to put you to sleep, and then when it's bright, we shut off melatonin and we wake up. That's why you fall asleep in a dark room, you wake up when the lights come on. And then we'll talk about the ventricles and the choroid plexus in just a little bit. One of the things I want to get to, and I'm going to erase some of this, but if you think about it, the higher up we go, the more higher thinking and the more complex thinking becomes. This is survive. This is some coordination to increase our chances to survive. This starts putting memory and emotions into it so that we can remember where to go and where not to go. And then up here, we start getting very complex in our thinking about being a social organism. By the way, the limbic system and some of this lower brain is often referred to as the reptilian complex. Because if you think about an alligator or a snake, they're not social. They don't hang out in groups and do things. Turtles either. All these reptiles do is they have instincts. If an alligator's hungry, you're not going to stop it from eating. If an alligator wants to mate, it's going to mate. There is no thought about, oh, well, does she like me? Is she interested in me? What's going to happen if I just go jump on this other female alligator? None of that. There's no complex processing. In our society, the higher up we go in organisms, the more complex it becomes. We're going to talk about that. I know this video is getting long, but just bear with me here. I got to finish up. Actually, yeah, let's just finish, okay? So, when it comes to the cerebral cortex has a number of areas that are very specialized. When we look at the brain, there are two cerebral hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And because we're cross-wired, the right hemisphere is monitoring the left half of my body and controlling it. The left hemisphere is monitoring the right half of my body and controlling it. It receives sensory input at the postcentral gyrus and then sends motor commands out through the precentral gyrus to the opposite side of the body. each hemisphere, while they look identical, house slightly different centers and nuclei for different functions. There's a bunch of anatomical structures that we can talk about. The gyri and sulci, they're just folds that increase the surface area massively. When we talk about the brain itself, the cerebral cortex, I should say, we can divide it into lobes. All of the frontal lobe up here has a number of structures that are involved with motor coordination from the precentral gyrus. We talked about Broca's brain a little bit, where we do the motor coordination for speech. But way up here at the prefrontal cortex, this is where we do some of our most complex thinking. This is where we do sequential events. So if someone gives you a whole bunch of numbers, and asks you to put them in order from smallest to largest or largest to smallest, you could rearrange these. That would be putting things in sequence. Or if you want to make lasagna, what do you got to do first? What do you got to do second? What are the steps? There's a lot of that sequential thinking that happens there, as well as a lot of cause and effect thinking. So if somebody makes you mad, an instinctive behavior might be to punch them in the face. But in our society, if you do that, you can get arrested and go to jail. You can lose your job. Other people might come attack you for punching someone. Their friends might get upset. It's not okay to do that just because someone made you mad. So there's a lot of cause and effect. Someone walks up, says something really mean and nasty. Your reaction might be, I want to do this, but I don't want to get arrested. I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to do this. So I better not. It's thinking about the cause and effect of your actions and interactions and reactions. Which, by the way, a lot of drugs, alcohol, so to some degree marijuana, but methamphetamine, cocaine, and a lot of those things, they have a lot of damage they do in the prefrontal cortex. This is why people who abuse these drugs don't realize the effects of their actions. They tell their children, if you ever watch a TV show like Intervention, a lady runs off for weeks doing drugs with some guy, comes home and gets to see her family and her children. She's like, oh, mommy loves you. I love you so much. You're the most important thing in the world. All right, see ya. I got to go do some more crack. They don't think about the effects of what they're doing to the people around them. They have an inability to make those connections because they damage that prefrontal cortex. Now, the parietal lobe has a lot of sensory information that it monitors. One of the things I really want to point out is the occipital lobe does a lot of visual information, and the temporal lobe does a lot of auditory and olfactory processing. Olfaction is the sense of smell. So we process smells and sounds in the temporal lobe. So if someone damages the visual cortex, they may not be able to see or interpret what they see. Here, if they damage, they may lose the ability to interpret sounds and smells. And up here, we can't do a whole lot of thinking about the consequences of our actions. Okay, so there's a lot of temporal specializations that's on page 75 and page 76. It talks about the speech area and prefrontal cortex. We're going to skip the sort of central white matter. I do want to talk about hemispheric specialization. For hemispheric specialization, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere do slightly different functions. I tend to think of the left hemisphere as sort of the we call it the interpretive hemisphere because it does a lot of interpreting of information. It's sort of the logical part of your brain. It controls a lot of things like numbers and thinking and science and logic. It's the logical half of your brain. The right hemisphere is sort of the artsy-fartsy brain. We do a lot of interpreting of sounds and images and things like that. Some of us are extremely right-brained, very artistic, not very logical, not very good thinkers. Some people are extremely scientific, They couldn't draw a crooked line if they tried. They have no interest in art, no ability to interpret art or play an instrument. Most people are a balance of one or the other. I mean, a balance of the two with a little more one than the other. But for the most part, the right brain is artsy-fartsy. The left brain is more logical and categorical hemisphere is what we tend to call it. All right. We talked a little bit about the basal ganglia, how the basal ganglia do some motor control. When you damage them, you mess up some of the motor systems. The dopamine neurons in there, when they get damaged, we get Parkinson-like tremors and things. The limbic system I've already talked about. It does emotions and instinctive behaviors in the amygdala and memory in the hippocampus. We've already talked about the hypothalamus, thalamus, the pineal gland, the corpora quadrigemina, and the cerebellum. So we've already worked all the way through page 78 in the note set. I went through all the major things there. Okay, I'm going to stop this video now because it's getting kind of long. It's at 45 minutes. And we got one more video coming on the cranial nerves. And really everything you need to know about the cranial nerves is listed on page 79 in my note set. You need to know the number of the nerve, the Roman numeral, the name of the nerve, and then what is its function. We'll do that in the next video. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope this was helpful. It didn't feel like the smoothest lecture I've given, but nonetheless, time is short. We got to do what we got to do. So, hope you had as much fun as I did. I hope this was helpful. See you on the flip side.